All right, cool. So today's office hours, Patrick, you wanted to talk about testing Express. And then Danielle, what do you want to talk about? How to set and use environment variables. Yep, okay. Cool, we can do both of those together. A factory function. Okay, we can talk about ifs. I am only a little bit aware of factories, but we'll research it and look at it. Okay, this should be enough. Actually, oh my god. All right, so we'll make a little Express app and then we'll just test it. Go away. Okay. Can y'all read this? Should I make it bigger? So we need Express. And what else are we going to need for this? We'll do that. And then chai HTTP is what we'll use to test the Express app. Oh, and then if we want to talk about environment variables, let's do that at the same time. Okay. Let's set this up. All right, so we need just an app.js, and we'll require Express, and we'll make our app, and then we'll do app.listen to port. And then when the app is finally up, we'll console log http://localhost : port. And we're going to get port from an environment variable. So, something like that. So here's an example of using an environment variable so our app knows how to start itself or what port it should start on. And it has a default to 3000. We could also just make it throw an error if you didn't provide a port, right? So, so if we just do node app.js, you'll see that it starts on 3000. We can specify a port on the command line by just putting it before the command. And then that'll be just for this command, that environment variable will be set. You can do like port equals 3456 echo $port. Like you can do, I think you need this semicolon. No, there you go. So for example, if I just assign this environment variable before the echo command, then I can echo that environment variable. So this is a way to temporarily set environment variables just when you're running a command. So there's other environment variables. I think there's a node debug environment variable. Yeah, so here's an example of setting node debug, the environment variable, to this comma-separated list of module names, and I believe those module names will then optionally, if this is set, start logging some debugging information. So if we were having a problem with using like fs read file and we needed some more debugging information, we could put node debug equals fs and then run our script, and we should get some additional debugging. So there's a couple of other node variables, environment variables that that we can set. And we can also just, our application can use as many of them as we want, right? We can just access, man, I don't see this going up and down. I hope I'm not muted. Can you hear me? No? Great. Cool. Sweet. So we can use any other environment variable we want, right? So if we were setting up a database or something, right? We could do, and we needed to tell Postgres where our database was, we could put something in like a database URL environment variable or something like that. So this is one way for us to set our environment variable when we start our app. So I can start it on whatever port I want, but we don't generally want to have to type in all these environment variables like every time we want to start our app in development. And there's a difference here between development and other environments. So I'll talk about that for a second. Applications tend to have this concept of an environment, and it really just is sort of a name for the kind of environment that you're in, right? So when we run a web application, we at least run it in development mode on our local machines versus production mode when it's running like in our actual production environment, right? So often we'll have an environment variable called node-env. This comes from the Rails world where Rails kind of invented this Rails-env thing, and then there's like a whole bunch of variations on that. But basically node-env is telling Node what environment that it is in, right? So in development, we're generally going to have our node-env be development, and in production, on like Heroku or something, we'll set it to production. And so it doesn't actually get set in code the way I'm showing here, right? This is just a comparison. This node-env production would be set by Heroku. Heroku's also going to set the port, that because Heroku needs you to start on a very specific port, because in their environment that you're on a shared machine, and so you get like a dynamically assigned port. So that's why it's important for our app to look at the port environment variable. Also on Heroku, when you turn on Postgres as a Heroku service, they're going to give you a database URL as an environment variable. So a lot of these things are set for you in your production environment, but in development, we need to set them up because it's going to be different on my machine than on your machine, probably. Right? So how do we set up some local environment variables that get loaded every time our app starts? And I like to use a library called .env, D-O-T-E-N-V. And all this library does is allow you to create a file, generally called .env, that you do not check in to your application's source code. These are going to contain, this file is going to contain contents that we do not want on GitHub, that we do not need as part of our deploy process. So it's just going to be a standalone file on our machine that's not version controlled. So in order to do that, we need to take the .m string and append it to our gitignore file, so that our gitignore file contains .m, and Git will not try to check in that file. Does that part make sense to everybody? Sweet. So inside of our env file, we're just going to specify whatever information we want set in addition in our environment variables. So node-env will set to development, and we will be on port 3014. So then we want to require .env, and I think you just say, oops, I think you just say load. So to illustrate this, I'm going to console log what our port from process.env.port is before and after I load our .m file. And you'll see it was undefined before, and then we loaded that file, and it added these environment variables on top of whatever environment variables were set by the shell that ran this command. Yeah.
So that .env file, is that where you would potentially place like API keys?
API keys, database URL, whatever configuration information we need for our application to run in our environment. So on my laptop is its own environment. My Postgres could be running in a million different places. I could need the app to run on on some different port than you do on your machine, and whatever other stuff we need to just say, like, here's how you work here, right? Cool. So again, things like this. So one other thing we want to do, and this might get a little tricky, is I generally don't set my node-env inside my .env here, because I only want to load the .m file if I'm in the development environment. So I'm going to put this to just port, and I'm going to come up here and I'm going to say process.env.node-env equals itself, but if it's blank, default to development. So I'm going to throw that at the top of my script to say, if node-env isn't set, I'm just going to pretend we're in development mode. That's my default. Okay. Now in our production environment, we're going to set node-env to production. And maybe if we had a staging server, that would be like where we're testing our new version of our app, we'd have an environment called staging. I've also worked in environments where we had our production app, but we also had a demo of a future version of the app. So if a team feature, we could roll up a demo server. And so we'd have an environment called demo. And then that would have like some special environment variables for it. So I'm going to say default to node-m development. And then I'm going to come down here and say, if my node-m is development, then load my .m file. But in production, we're not going to have one of those, right? So we're not going to load it. So I start the app, and we started on 3014, which came from our .env file. Cool.
Why do you not have one of those in production?
We don't have one in production because some of these environment variables are given to us by default by our hosts, which I'm mostly talking about hosting things on Heroku. If you hosted something on your own virtual machine, like on Amazon S3 or DigitalOcean or whatever, you would have to set these environment variables on those machines themselves. And maybe you'd use a .m for that, but probably not. You'd probably just set those on a system basis rather than on an application basis, right? But most of the deployment stuff that you'll do here is on Heroku. So Heroku's gonna provide what port you're gonna start on for you. So you don't need to do that. But you also have a way, so I won't show here because there's all my environment variables for all the apps I can think of have stuff in that I don't want in this video, but Heroku gives you a mechanism for setting environment variables. So you can say, this version of this deployed version of the app, this Heroku app, as they call it, is set in development mode, or this one's set in staging or demo or production. And when we push to those, our app will run a little bit differently because those apps kind of have those environment variables. And the Heroku web interface and the command line interface give you a mechanism for setting those environment variables. So we don't need .m on Heroku, and we probably wouldn't use it on another production environment.
And what about like YAML files? Like config files stuff?
YAML is just a format like JSON or XML. So it's usually used for configuration files, but it could be used for anything.
Sure.
So there's probably another library other than .m that would load environment variables from a YAML file or something like that. And there's other systems there are like continuous integration environments where we're going to run our tests in the cloud somewhere. And so some of those are configured with YAML files, and you put environment variables in there and stuff. Does that answer your question? Cool. All right. So does that get you what you need about environment variables?
I think so. Maybe one other thing is, do people sometimes have a test environment? And how do you
Oh yeah, I'm surprised. Thank you. I didn't even think about that. So yes, for example, let's actually get into a case where we have a database URL. So let's say, I need a Postgres URL, and I think it's just psql://localhost 4567. I can't remember. Let's open Post2Go. 5432. Thank you. I knew it was something like that. And then you do like, lecture example app, right? So this might be, and this might be wrong. I can never remember Postgres URL formats off the top of my head, but this was essentially a URL that represents like what Postgres database you should connect to. Let's see if it works. PSQL. Yeah, so this database doesn't exist, but if I created the lecture example app database on my local machine, then I could connect to it. Anyway, I think this database URL is incorrect, but it should serve as a...
I think instead of PSQL, maybe it's Postgres.
Yeah, I think so.
Oh,
Maybe
thank you.
3 slashes.
Oh, look at that. It worked. Okay. 2 slashes seems to work. Cool. So it's Postgres, not PSQL. That makes more sense. All right, cool. So this represents like, where's the server? What port is it running on? That's the same thing. Like what machine is the server on? What port is it running on? And what database connecting to is all encapsulated in this URL. So it's a good way to say like, here's how you get to Postgres. I can put a remote Postgres. I can put something in the cloud based on a URL like this. But this is telling my database, my application where my database is and how to connect to Postgres, right? And so we might do something like this is going to be pseudocode as well. Something like that, right? So we're going to require Postgres, and we're going to connect our Postgres via the database URL. And now this is actually going to work if we were deploying to Heroku and we turned on the Postgres add-on, because this is where they set a URL to tell you how to connect to Postgres. They just put it in database URL. So this will work in development and it'll work in production, but work in test. Normally in test, we're going to have a test directory. And we're going to have some sort of test file. And we're going to say like Mocha that test file, right? So what I like to do if I have a test environment where we have a database or where we have an application where we're dealing with environments is I'll make a file called, and it doesn't matter where this lives, but I'm just call it setup inside of our test directory. And inside of this directory, I'm actually going to come in here and I'm going to change some environment variables. I'm going to say that this app, whatever the environment variable is, if you're running this test setup file, we're going to overwrite your node-env with the test environment variable. Because if you're running Mocha and you're running this Mocha test setup file, we're definitely going to want to be running in the test environment. Yeah.
Sorry, did you create the setup file right here when you typed Mocha test setup J?
Oh, no, I did not. But I did by just editing it, and this was a typo. Thank you. I meant to do touch there. I just brain farted that. Yeah, cool. No magical thing. We just have that in the test environment. So then I might actually, in my test setup file, I might put this here as well. This would be okay to put here. Although this probably would be different for your, I don't know, there's a number of ways we could do this. We could do something like test database URL and put this here. And then when we're running tests, we're going to say, okay, our database URL is going to be our test database URL. So are all these three pieces coming together?
Yeah.
Cool. So one other piece you have to do for this is in your package JSON, when we have our test command, we're going to want to do Mocha, run the setup file first, and then run whatever's in test. So now when we do npm here, and I'll put some logs in here. And then inside of our actual app test file, I'll just put a little dummy thing. Well, this isn't going to work just yet. But now when we run npm run test, you see that we got the setup file was run, and then we ran our test. And so the setup file is going to put our app into test mode. We haven't even required our app in test yet, so our app code isn't even running in our test environment yet. But if we needed to for some reason, when we finally require our app, we could do things like have some routes in here. We may or may not want to do this, but you could say, okay, if we're running in test mode, I need like a secret backdoor or something like that. I could make some routes that were only existed in my app if we're running in test mode or if we're running in development mode. So we now have access to sort of run a little differently depending on what tests we want. This is actually something you should try to avoid as much as possible. It's okay to make some backdoors if you need it for your test environment or something, but when we're testing our application, we don't want it to work differently in different environments because then we can't really test what's happening in all environments, right? So we want to minimize this kind of stuff as much as possible, but we could do it. Cool. Does that, yeah.
On that setup file for the test.
Yeah.
Is that just pseudocode or did you?
No, this is good. This is good, yeah.
You don't have to do an if statement or anything like that?
An if for what condition?
to actually check at the end of the test.
Mm.
I guess I'm just not understanding how.
Got it. It's actually a little bit backwards, right? So let's start from the beginning. When I run Mocha, it's going to run this test file, this setup file. Whenever I run Mocha, I want to just assert I am in the test environment. You cannot run Mocha and run our tests outside of the test environment. That wouldn't make sense in my opinion. So the setup file itself just overwrites whatever node-env was and sets it to test. And it's going to do that before we require our app file. And this is going to be our, web server. We didn't export it yet, but I'm going to get to that because we're going to test this web app. So before we require our app code, which is going to look at whether or not we're in the development environment and maybe have some other conditions about whether we're in the test environment. Before that happens, we just assert we're in the test environment, right? As opposed to just running our app directly, which at the very top says, okay, if no one specified what environment we are, then we're going to default to development. So that's not going to get overwritten when we run our tests. But if we run if we run our app just by itself, and it'll default to development. And then also, if we run it in production, this will be set to production. Yeah. So let's move forward and test this thing. So we don't even have any routes. So let's make some routes. And I'm going to install NodeMon. If I could type today.
You know what, man, you're right. I think I'm going to start writing full request response setup like Raspberry.
I really do not like shorthand variable names at all. There's probably some rare cases in which I'd prefer it. There's some rare cases where if I'm doing something like this, you know what I mean? Like this is a simple enough equation function thing that like no one's confused by that. But when I start seeing like iterations with I instead of index and things like that, oh, thank you very much, Bonnie. It just requires that you try harder. It just requires more cognitive load to understand that code, and that's a burden I'm putting on other people. And I prefer to have a 25 character long variable name than a 4 character long variable name. So cool. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I've got NodeMon. I'll spawn another terminal here, and I'll run our app. Oh yeah, of course, this was pseudocode. We're not doing Postgres at the moment.
Could you increase the font size in that picture?
In that little one, yeah. I was gonna keep it small because we don't need to read any of it, but
okay.
But I'm just running the app down there. Cool. Let's spawn our app. Great, and this is the homepage. Cool. So ridiculously simple single route app. Let's test it. So we're gonna run npm test. And it runs our one test, but it's pretty meaningless at this point because there's nothing going on in there. So I want to make expectations, and it's going to fail because I actually don't have expect yet, right? I could get expect by doing require chai.expect, but I don't want to do this in every single test file. I'm going to have multiple test files, so I've got this nice setup file. So I'm just going to make this global. I normally would never ever use global variables for anything, but Mocha already sets that precedent. It puts a global describe and a global it and a global context. So like, I'm just going to make a global expect, and so now every test file I run that's going to be run after I run the setup file will just have describe, it, expect. Just going to have the stuff that I need.
Is there ever any issues with making something like expect global? Because it's only ever going to be used in the test environment anyway, right?
Yeah, like that's why I think this is an okay exception to the rule of never using globals. Like for logic in your application or storing state in an application, global variables would be a terrible way to wire things together. But the only downside to this is if you had code in your actual application where you used a method called expect, then you may have a bug where in your real code that you're testing, you're using some code using expect code that was put there by the test environment, and that can get murky, but hopefully you're not using a method called or a function called expect inside your actual code. If you were, I would say don't do this and we'll require it everywhere we need it, right? But I've never run into that, but if I did, I would change the way my test environment was set up.
Jared, have
Yeah.
you ever seen global before? Is that an object, like a node object that's top level? Kind of
Yeah,
like
so
Windows in the browser?
In all JavaScript environments, both Node and, well, I won't say all, but Node and most browser environments, the global object, the top level scope is an object. In the browser, window is an alias for that. So window.window.window.window.window is just the same object on itself, right? It's like if you had an object with a key that's property was the object itself, a self-referencing object, right? We could do that. We could say thing equals an object, and then thing dot thing equals thing, right? Now we have a circular reference, and you can just do this all day long, right? So window is like that in the browser environment. Window is a global variable that is a reference to the top level object, the top level scope, or I don't actually honestly should know the right word for that, but I don't. So anywhere in our JavaScript code in the browser, we can say window dot and assign something, and you're essentially creating a global variable. It's the same thing in Node. You've got a global object, and that is, if I do global dot Jared equals 42, Jared is now just a global variable. Yeah. So global dot global dot global, that is that's the same thing. Cool. Cool. So I created a global expect. And then I'm probably, I'm not going to do this here. I'm going to, that should be it for our setup. So now inside of our app test code, I'm going to go get our app, which, and then we'll just say expect app dot, let's see, actually don't know. Let's just say expect app to be an object, which I think it is. It's a pretty simple expression. And I don't expect this to work because I think we're missing one other piece. Oh my God, go away. Okay, it did. Oh yeah, I know why that worked. Okay. So the thing that I'm missing from this, and let's see, how can we test this? I want to make it break first. How can we make sure that this app object actually is an express object?
With expect, you don't have to actually specify that it's an instance of an object. You can test that.
That it's a what?
An instance of an object, or just test it.
I think that's what this does, to be an object. Actually, to be an object probably does type of. But let's look at this manually. If I require the app file that we created, I just get back. Okay, I actually get back an error. Let's back up here. I think I'm getting ahead of myself. If we're going to test this Express app, we need a way to get access to the Express app instance object itself, the app variable here, without starting on a port, right? So normally, and this is actually in all the Express docs, they want you to be able to just run your app.js file and have it start, right? So we don't want to start our app if we're in the test environment. So I'm going to put in a conditional here that says, if we're in the if we're not in the test environment, then start our app. So now I can still do app.js, which, did I put this over here? No. So I can start our app just by running node app.js. But if I run our app, so I'll go back to nodemon here. It'll start. But if I do npm test now, it's going to require our app, and it's not going to start it. So I'll illustrate that just in the console by just require.app is no longer going to throw that. Oh, it is still. Oh, right. I'd have to set our node env to test and then require our app, and now it doesn't try to start it. Does that make sense? This way we're deciding when to start our app and when not to? Cool. So now there's another thing we need to do. So I'm going to make this an else. if we're in the test environment, we want to export the app because we need to get it so we can test it, right? So now if I set node M to test and I require the app, now I actually get back this object that has all kinds of stuff on it because this is our app, right? So let's make sure it is an Express app, and I'm not sure how to do that. I wonder if it's an instance of Express. And it's not. So I might just do this by looking at the app object and like making sure it has like, if it has an underscore router, you know what I mean? I'm just gonna look at like a property or a set of properties on this thing and just assume that it's the kind of object I'm looking for, just to make sure that in my test here, that app actually is
Express it.
Where do you see that?
Right down. Middle. Later. Express it.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's inside the router. That's getting a little deeper than I want. But maybe there's something in here called so I'm going to do Command K to clear my scroll back buffer, and now I can kind of search this with find, and I'm just going to do, if it would work, hello, Command F. No? My terminal is not letting me do a find? That's so weird. Oh, there it is. It's so weird. Did you all see it? Now, okay, weird. Express locals. All right, well, how about we do this? I'm going to say, I'll just set my own thing here. Just to make sure we're getting back this object that we care about, we're going to say expect app, express app to be true. And now we'll run npm test, and our test passes. Did that little extra bit make sense? No? Okay. Here's our Express app, right? I want to make sure that in our test environment, when we require app, we're getting that object back, right? So I'm putting a little custom property on it just so that I can test that that property's there. So I know those objects are the same objects. Does that clear that up? Cool.
Do you know why Mocha highlighted Express?
Yeah, I don't think it's Mocha. I think it's the terminal. I think
It's
he's
the
still
terminal.
searching for Express.
Yeah.
Like that finds.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I know what's going on. There we go. Okay, so yeah, I had Express as a search. Unfortunately, the reason I couldn't see this little search thing before is because my window was like off the screen. It was wider than I had. I forgot that when I increase my font size, it just like makes my window bigger. All right. All right, so now we don't actually have any useful tests other than we got this app back, right? So now I'm going to get into like testing this Express app. And to do that, I'm going to use chai HTTP. And I don't remember how to use it. So I'm going to go look at the docs.
Let's do it.
So we have to require it and tell chai that we're using it. So this is something I'm going to put in my setup file, my test setup file. And so I'm going to change this around a little bit because I need chai. So then this will just become chai expect. And then we need to tell chai to use chai HTTP. And I think that'll do it.
Equal up to chai.
Thank you. All right, and then what else do we got to do? How do we test this thing? Something like that. We can make a request directly to our app. And then we could do a .end. Sweet. All right, so in our, so I'm going to do another describe, and I'll say describe a get to slash. And so we'll say I'm gonna, I don't actually have access to chai, right? Because I didn't require it in this file and I didn't make it a global. So I don't have chai.request. I'm actually just going to make another global called request. So in my test environment, I can say request this app, and we're going to request slash, and we're not going to send any, oops, we're not going to send any data. And this is an asynchronous test, so I'm going to get my done function ready and go like that. And then we'll expect error to be null and response to have status 200. So let's see if this works. And,
Get instead of put on
oh, thank you. I do. Get. Sweet. So let's break this. Let's go into our test here, and we're going to send a response status 500. And instead of this, I'll send server error. And our test failed. We expected, it actually, interesting aspect of chai HTTP is if I render a server error, I actually get an error object here, right? So it didn't even get to response code. If I moved this up, the test failure would be expected response code to be 200, but got 500. Yeah. So we know this is working, right? Because I broke it and then I can fix it and the test passes. So now I'm confident that this test is asserting that these things are working the way that they're supposed to. Yes?
I understand the using done for asynchronous, but I would like to be clear.
Sure. It's possible that this is not an asynchronous test. Let's just confirm that. If it is, it'll just hang. Okay, so it's actually not. So when we're testing HTTP web applications, normally HTTP requests can't be done in a synchronous way. We have to wait at least for another tick in the event loop to get the result back. But in this case, we're actually doing something a little bit tricky. We're not even really starting our application on a port and then making a real HTTP request. Chai HTTP knows how to take the app itself and just send it in memory, in process requests. It's basically simulating requests, right? So there's actually no port, there's no reading and writing of an asynchronous like IO stream or any of that stuff. There's no need for us to do an asynchronous part for this. We can actually just go make a function call, get back the response, and at least for this request, everything can be synchronous. Now, if we had a route that was doing something asynchronous, we'd probably have to come back in here and do done again. But everything seems to be happening within the same event loop for this kind of route. But we can test it. We can make a route that does an asynchronous task like read a file and then respond, and then we'd probably have to come in here and put done. So pretending that we had that, this callback that we're passing to end might get run in the future and not in the same thread, you could call it, like iteration of the JavaScript event loop. So we would have to come in here and say, hey, Mocha, you can't assume this test will finish within a synchronous call to this. So Mocha is gonna, when it decides to run this test, it's gonna run this function, and it's gonna assume that if that function doesn't raise an error, that the test is good. But if you put done in here, it reads the source code of this function and finds out whether you put done in here or not, which is kind of a weird hacky thing to do, but they do it that way. And it will say, okay, you want a done function, great, I'll give you a done function, and instead of waiting for this function to complete, I'm gonna wait for you to call the done function, and if you call the done function with no error, I'll assume the test is good, right? So we need to have our done function here. At least not for this test. I'm pretty sure, I think that's, there might be a caveat in there. My formatting's off, but I think that's enough explanation for how that's working. Yeah.
Or my introduction to this, they use this other package called Nas,
As a different way to test?
Yeah, like the
Yeah, there's a bunch of different ones. Yeah.
server is try HTTP doing the same thing.
I don't know how knock works. I don't think I've used it. I've used another library called Supertest, and I think they all generally do the same thing. Honestly, I don't know, and if I were to use a different one that I've never used before, I would have to just play with it, and I would figure out, and if I was confused on how different steps were happening, I'd start logging stuff, and I'd start kind of a little bit of reverse engineering just to find out, like, how's this thing testing my app. But they should all relatively work the same way. I can imagine someone's written a way to test an app in Mocha that actually starts the app on some port and then makes real HTTP requests to it, but this one I know is kind of going under the hood a little bit. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah.
So this request function on line 10, that is different than the rec object that we get.
Absolutely. There's so many different things that we call request, right? There's even a node module called request, right? So sometimes when you see a request function, it talks about making it's from the request npm module, and it's actually making a real HTTP request. This is request as a function. If we're over here, this request object is not a function. It's an object that represents the request that came in. So it has data about the URL and the params and the headers and all the details about the request that was made, right? So it's a totally different object. This request method here actually came from chai HTTP and is chai HTTP's request method, which is doing a request to a node HTTP compatible object, right? Yeah. Of course, yeah. Sure. Okay. So if we do a post to slash, I don't know, frogs, we're going to create a new frog here. And then we're going to look. So we're going to need like a body parser. So I'm going to have to go get. And I'm going to have to npm install that. And I can never remember how body parser works, but I think it's app.use body parser.
Or whatever.
No, I want the URL encoded one. Can never remember.
Oh, body parser.
Oh, body parser. I probably can't remember because every time I need to do it, I just go copy and paste it instead of typing it. But here we go. All right, so now we have a body parser. And so in here, whenever I make a post request, I usually just do response.json request.body just to make sure that the data I'm sending in is the data that I'm getting. Make sure my body parser is all set up correctly and stuff. So let's find out. Let's go to this app and we'll do, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this by hand here. Let's use curl. What are we running on again? 3014. All right, check it out. So I did a curl, and if you do -- data, it just assumes you're doing a post. And then I'm saying, okay, so post this URL encoded data to /frogs, and it rendered back a JSON version of that data, right? And if I put -v here, you'll see that I did a post to /frogs, content type URL encoded. I got back a 200 content type JSON, and here's the body of the JSON version of the data that I posted, right? So this is sort of a manual test for me to just make sure that that my post route is parsing my body and getting that data correctly. Yeah.
Do you recommend using curl or like something like Postman?
Postman's a great tool too. I love living in the command line, so I use curl for stuff, but Postman's a great tool for that too. Cool. So now we know we have this. So let's do something where we're pretending we're getting back a frog. Let's just render a fake frog. So we'll say name is request.body.name and color, and we'll give it a fake ID. And so cool, we get back a fake ID and name and color. And so let's pretend that that's working, right? So this all makes sense? Any questions? No? Cool. Okay, so let's write a test for that. So I'm gonna write a describe for a post to /frogs. And I'll put a context in here when posting name equals Kermit. And color equals green. It should render the new frog as JSON.
I haven't seen that context before.
Context is literally the same function as describe, but I use it in a meaningful way where you describe nouns, and context is about the state of the world, right? So when you're testing something like let's say we were testing the index request, the index. So we want to get a list of all of our frogs, right? So we're going to test what happens when we do a get to frogs, right? But there's at least two contexts here, right? There's context when there are zero frogs in the database, right? Versus when there are 10 frogs in the database. Like there's going to be different behavior there, right? So I'll set these two different contexts, and then actually in these contexts, I'm going to do a before each to actually make the world that way, right? So in here, I'll truncate the frogs table. But over here, I'm gonna truncate the frogs table and insert 10 frogs, right? So there's part of our test suite is, a huge part of our test suite is setting up the world to be in different states so that we can test what our app does in that environment or in that state, right? And that's actually some of the hardest parts about testing. Sometimes, oh gosh, too many times do my test code end up being like 10 times the size of the code that I'm testing. Right? It's just crazy that way. Cool. So we don't need that. But cool. So we're going to describe what happens when we post to frogs when we're posting this. So I probably can come in here and put, well, I'll just do this down here. So we're going to do a post to /frogs, and I need to look at the docs of how to do a post. Great, we can just send that. I wonder if it'll send that as URL encoded or not. Let's do this field. Post a form with some data. Let's do field here. So we're going to do a post field name equals Kermit and
Give Kermit the respect he deserves.
what do you mean?
Capitalize his name.
Yeah, exactly. And he's colored green. And then we expect not to get an error. We expect to get a status 200, and we expect the response.body. Is that how that works? How do you assert anything about the body? That's cool. We can expect it. Oh, that's the request? CBJSON? Weird. Huh, there's not a single example in here on how to assert what's in the body. Okay. Okay, chai, HTTP, response body or JSON. All right, let's just look at response body. I'm just going to come in here and console log response.body and response.json and see if these actually do anything. npm test. Okay, response.body did come back, but it didn't come back with what we expected, so that's good. Let's write an expectation. Expect response.body to equal, well, we want expect response.body.id to be a number, and then we want body.name to equal permit, and we want color to be green. And this should fail. That did not fail. Why did that not fail? Yes.
I got another question. When I'm testing like an object like that, if I should have like 3 different specs, like a number,
Yep.
or just like expecting to return.
Yep. Here's why we can't do this in this case. Right? Like it would be nice to come in here and be like, I know what the ID is going to be. In this case, we don't because I set it to a random number. And in most cases, the database is going to set that. So I can't come in here and do name and color as one big object, right? I can't say, here's the exact thing this object should be because I just don't know.
So if you know, is it better to do it that way?
I prefer to do it that way if I do know, yeah. Yeah.
Is it also better to test individual keys or to just do a deep equal on the like to expect like this object to deep equal the response?
Yeah, if you know the full response, and then a deep equal, I think it's just clearer to read like here's a literal object. It should be exactly this is pretty expressive, right? Whereas if I have like 14 different expects, you know, it's a little bit more to read that stuff. There's also a little bit of a difference where like if you do an expect on a big object, it'll generally tell you if there are 5 things that don't match, it'll tell you about all 5 things. But if you have 5 expects and the first one fails, you don't get to even try the next one. So you may not get as much detail, but it's a trade-off, right? And in this case, we don't even get to do this one. So there's like a kind of a hacky way where you can do this, where you can be like, okay, expect everything in this object to be that, and part of my object came from the object I'm checking. It's a little bit weird. I've seen it done. I wouldn't recommend it, but you could do it that way. But why the heck is this passing? Because I logged this thing. Typing too fast. Yeah, look at that. Okay, what if it's equal, huh, what's going on here? I wonder what is happening. So you can see how easy it is for us to get into a false positive.
Can it have something to do with the field?
So even if I just return an empty object, is my test still passing? Yeah, what is up? Okay, so this is why it's super important when you write a test and you run it and it's green that you make sure that you can break it, right? So we can't break this test, so something's wrong, right? So we're getting here. Are we getting here? And we're not. This tells me an error is being raised, but we're not. It's not causing our test to fail. So what I'll do just temporarily is I'll just wrap everything here in a try catch. Okay, so we are getting an assertion error raised, but for whatever reason, it's not causing our Mocha test to fail. This might be an async thing. So if there's an error, we're going to call done with that error, and then this should make our test fail. Great. Okay. So I don't know why we need to do this with try HTTP. I'm not sure why.
Having to do with deeply equal is it doesn't it have an assertion that says deeply equal?
Well, it's not a problem with our assertions. We know we have an assertion that's failing and raising an error. Our test should be failing in this case, but it's not failing because whenever this function's being run, Mocha is not able to catch the errors that are happening in this function. What I'm guessing is happening is that Mocha is running this outer function here, and then this is actually doing an asynchronous thing. Which so later we have a function that's being run, it's throwing an error, but Mocha has no idea because that's on another thread in the future, right? So Mocha just knows like, okay, you're doing something async, here's a function to call when you're done, let us know if there was an error. So we have to do this try catch thing, but there's probably a more prescribed way to set up and use this so that Mocha can catch these errors. So I'm really surprised that this doesn't work by off the top. Or by default, but I will, I'm going to call done at the end here. And then we should be able to make this test work if we put this back to the correct, great. And expected undefined to deeply equal Kermit, great. And we are seeing that we're not getting Kermit back. So we're request.body.name, request, so I don't know why. So I'm actually just going to tack on another key here temporarily of the entire request body because I'm logging this object, right? So I want to see like, why am I not getting the request body I expect? And we can see the request body is null or empty, not null, empty. So for some reason, this thing where we're saying field, name, and color, that's not working. So let's go look at chai again, .post. I'll try this send one and see what it does. And it goes after the post. Okay, so send. See if that sends data. Nope. Nah, it's okay. That trailing comma is fine. But why are you not sending my data? It's possible that it's sending it via JSON for some reason, so we need like the body parser JSON thing, but chai HTTP, I want you to send URL encoded. All right, so I have to explicitly tell this thing to use URL encoded. That sucks. Let's see if this works. There we go. Okay, so that's a little unfortunate that it defaults, but you know, a lot of APIs want JSON, or at least I prefer to set up APIs that do JSON, but like this is more true to what an HTML form would send. So I'm not that surprised that chai HTTP seems to default to JSON and we have to set this, but does that difference make sense though? Does that solution make sense? Why this content type header is fixing the problem?
Really quickly explain what URL encoding.
Yeah, URL encoding is taking data. So this is the query string library. So URL encoding takes, or what is it? I can't remember how to use it. I'll find it. There we go, stringify. Ah, whose fault is that? That's Crawford's fault. Okay, so we take some data, A equals 1, name equals Jared, and colors equals red and green, right? And we want to encode this data in a way that can be in a URL query string. So that's what URL encoding does. It takes data and it converts it into a URL query string, right? And so if we have like special characters in here, like Steve, $thing, right? We have some special characters in here. You can see that this getting encoded in this %number format, right? So that's what's happening here is we're saying take this data and send it as part of the body, not in the URL. So URL encoding both works for the query part of a URL and for the post body part of a form. So when we create a form, it has keys and values, names and values, right? That gets encoded into this string. If we had a form, I'd show you that. You can see it in the node, or not the node, the Chrome Developer Tools network tab for each request. You can see the post body. It'll be URL encoded by default. That's what browsers do by default. JSON didn't exist back when forms were being created. So we're trying to simulate that. So we're going to URL encode this data that we're sending. All right, so we don't need these console logs anymore, and we can npm test this thing, and it says it works. So as always, when it works, we want to try it. So I'm gonna, we don't need this anymore. So I'm gonna come over here, and I'm gonna take out the ID, and my test fails because it's not there. I'm gonna take out the name, and I'm making sure I'm getting meaningful error messages, right? It's supposed to equal Kermit, and it's supposed to equal green.
Do you
There's
think maybe you could take it out of the try catch now?
I don't think so. I do need to catch the expectation error. I think this is something I wouldn't want to do in the long term if I had like 300 of these tests. Now we still do need the catch. Well, actually I need to make a failure. Oh, look at that. Why was that? Why did I need that ever?
The body.
Maybe just because it wasn't knowing to encode it in the,
All right. Well,
encode the right way before.
do I even need the done then? No, I do need the done. I think. Expected undefined to be a number. Okay, cool. I'm actually not fully confident that I understand how that's fixing it, but cool. So that's the gist, right? The takeaways are you make a specific request and then you get back the response and you just assert things about the response, and that's how you test HTTP requests. Cool.
Thank you.
We did not get to the other things. We didn't get to this one. We'll have to do it next time.
Okay.
Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you, Jared.
That's great.